Well, hello, Tigers. I'm Finn J.D. John of OffbeatOregon.com, author and public historian and presenter of a variety of Stumptown Stories shows at the Jack London Bar on the first Tuesdays of each month. This is my December show. It was presented on December 2nd, 2013. It's part one of a two-part series on bootlegging the Oregon Way. Part one is the old ancient origins of bootlegging the Oregon Way, Blue Ruin, and the ladies' number one whiskey riot. Let's get this started, shall we? I don't know if you guys have been watching your calendar like I have, but on Thursday, I hope you'll join me in hoisting a goblet of turkey and a toast to the end of the great American Prohibition experiment. It's the 80-year anniversary of the end of Prohibition, and it's the 169-year anniversary of the beginning. That last item is not quite as well known. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, there's a well-known story of Prohibition, and there's a not-so-well-known story of Prohibition, and today we're going to talk about both of these things, but mostly, we're going to talk about the not-so-well-known part. So, let's get the easy part out of the way first. Doing my best professorial hunched-over a lectern impression here. In 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act over President Woody Wilson's veto, inaugurating the nationwide experiment that was Prohibition in America. It would not be repealed until 1933, when the 21st Amendment was blah, 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 blah. Got that? There will be a test. Good. Anyway, glad that's over with. Now let's talk about the interesting stuff. The first interesting thing I've got to tell you is that Prohibition in the U.S. did not start in 1919, like you've probably always thought it did. No, it started 65 years before that, and it started right here. In 1844, before Portland was even a town, the Oregon territorial government made us the first place in the United States to outlaw the use, manufacture, or sale of booze, which means, of course, that the fellows paddling up and down the river with bottles in the bilge were America's first bootleggers. Eat your heart out, Appalachia. Anyway, that's why I like to call bootlegging Oregon's second oldest profession. You know what Oregon's first oldest profession is, right? No, that's number 3. Maybe even 4 or 5, actually. Nope. Oregon's first oldest profession is land thief. I'm sorry to say this, but Oregon's second oldest profession, bootlegging, developed at least in part as a method of making Oregon's first oldest profession, land thievery, more doable. Well, we'll talk about that now. The full story of Oregon Territory's first experiment with Prohibition will probably never be known. Not a lot of written history has come down to us from the early 1840s in Oregon, and what we have is often contradictory, and sometimes it's written by people who have an axe to grind. But from the distance, it looks an awful lot like the whole thing was, well, inspired, if that's the right word, by the commercial activities of one man, a fellow named William Johnson, and his product, a rough and ready distilled beverage marketed under a picturesque and, pretty much everybody agrees, accurate name, Blue Ruin. As an interesting side note, Pabst Blue Ribbon was established in 1844 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Johnson's Blue Ruin booze was established in Portland in 1844, but it was distilled for quite some time in a place that probably was Milwaukee. Coincidence? Sure. Well, here's another coincidence. The introduction of Johnson's Blue Ruin to the Willamette Valley frontier community was followed almost immediately by America's first prohibition law. What are the odds? The preamble to that law gives a few hints as to why the lawmakers felt it was necessary, and I'm going to go ahead and quote from it at length, because A, it's rich, ripe stuff, and B, it gives us a few clues. Here we go. Whereas the people of Oregon now occupy one of the most beautiful and interesting portions of the globe and are placed in the most critical and responsible position ever filled by men, having as they do important duties to themselves, to their century, to posterity, and to mankind as the founders of a new government and a young nation, and whereas The introduction, distillation, or sale of ardent spirits, under the circumstances in which we are placed, would bring withering ruin upon the prosperity and prospects of this interesting and rising community by involving us in idle and dissolute habits, inviting hither swarms of the dissipated inhabitants of other countries, cluttering emigration, destroying the industry of the country, bringing upon us the swarms of savages now in our midst, interrupting the orderly and peaceable administration of justice, and, in a word, get ready for this word, it's a humdinger. In a word, producing and perpetrating increasing and toward miseries that no mind can rightly estimate. Therefore, be it enacted by the Legislative Committee of Oregon as follows. Blah, blah, blah. Fair enough. Okay. Yet, the members of the Legislative Committee of Oregon were frontier men. I mean, they liked a little nip now and then, and they were not about to stop nipping. Why would they pass a law that most of them would subsequently be violating on a regular basis? Well, the answer lies coyly camouflaged among the references to industry and prosperity. It's the part about, quote, bringing upon us the swarms of savages now in our midst, which gets us right back to Mr. Johnson. Mr. William Johnson, it seems, had settled in a little clearing by the river a dozen or so miles downstream from Willamette Falls in around 1842. That's Willamette Falls there, by the way, with Oregon City in the foreground. Now, different sources give different accounts of Mr. Johnson. One account says that he was a scurrilous, hard-punching deserter from a British man of war who had settled there hiding out from the Brits as best he could. Others say that he was a 50-year-old family man, a veteran of the War of 1812 and an American hero in the War of 1812, born in Britain but turned against his native country to take up the cause of the Union and fighting valiantly against his former kinsmen, and who had settled in Champouie in the late 1830s with a successful farm. For some reason, he had then abandoned his land claim and moved 50 miles down the river, apparently without his wife, to stake out a new claim. Okay, the explanation is one of two things. Either there were two William Johnsons in the valley at the time, Farmer Johnson and Bootlegger Johnson, if you will, or there was only one, and he was on the run from the law, and he was making up stories for cover. I mean, after all, who's going to rat out an American war hero to the British who are looking for him to press him back into service in the Royal Navy? Well, you probably will have gathered which of those two theories I subscribe to, but it's one or the other. In any case, Bootlegger Johnson very quickly figured out that a hard-working, ambitious fellow in the distillery business could sell every drop of liquor he squeezed out of whatever horrific precursor sugars could be had. Table scraps, molasses, rotten tomatoes, floor sweepings from the nearest flour mill, whatever you got. And what came out of his still was like a raw, searing mixture of unaged grappa, white whiskey, and Everclear. I don't know, is it anything? I hope none of you guys are regular Velvet drinkers. I know I'm totally just being a hater here, but it's mostly because of their magazine ads, which I have derived considerable amusement from over the years. But back to Blue Ruin. It's also a pretty good bet that, being keen to save resources, Johnson didn't bother to discard the heads. Now, I don't know how many of you guys are moonshiners. I'm not going to ask for, for a show of hands or anything like that, because, who knows who's listening in on this. But for the rest of you, here's the explanation. The heads are the first ounce or two of liquor that comes out of the still with each batch. The heads are pure poison. They've got all the toxic hangover-inducing wood alcohols and other nasty chemicals that have a boiling point that's lower than ethyl alcohol. The way that this is working here in this picture of a home distillation kit is that beaker is boiling on the stove, and as it comes up to temperature, the steam comes out through that copper tubing, and it goes down through that cold water in the bucket and condenses. The water lowers its temperature down to the point where it turns back into a liquid, and it drips into that Pyrex thing in the sink there. This particular still is not a good setup, because if you will notice, there is a little downhill run there in the condensing coil that will collect the heads, and then they will just mix with the stuff that comes afterwards. The heads are some nasty, nasty stuff. You do not want to keep them. But I'm pretty sure that Blue Ruin was. Nasty stuff. Oh, kind of like Black Velvet. Anyway, I know I'm Sater. Anyway, Johnson's Blue Ruin booze was nasty, but it was cheap, and there was plenty of it.
Yeah, I know. I'm such a hater. I ought to be ashamed of me. Actually, I'm a little bit more worried about the Tanya Tucker fans than I am the Velvet drinkers. But anyway, Blue Ruin was rough, nasty stuff. It was considerably worse than Velvet, really. It was good enough, though, for Johnson's primary customers, the Native Americans. How's that for a buzzkill? Yeah. Well, now, many of the leaders of Oregon's provisional government were former Hudson's Bay Company employees, and they knew from firsthand experience that letting Native Americans buy as much whiskey as they wanted was a recipe for trouble. The Pacific Northwest natives had virtually no ability to resist liquor. They'd drink as much of it as they could get as fast as they could get, and it would transform them from peaceful, happy people into raging, brawling rioters. The best case scenario was a sharp drop in their production of otter pelts. The worst case, bloodshed and property destruction. Bad news. So the old Hudson's Bay men were careful to prevent whiskey from falling into Native American hands. And yet those Native American hands were really eager to get the stuff. You have to remember these guys hadn't known anything of whiskey for until about 10 years before this. It was a brand new, they had no ability to handle it. The laws of supply and demand being what they are, the arrival of Johnson or somebody like him was probably inevitable. Once Johnson's commercial enterprises came to the attention of U.S. Indian agent Elijah White, White hustled on over to Johnson's place and bashed up his still, destroyed it, smushed it. And it was about that time that the provisional government convened and outlawed his trade. Well, Johnson's reaction to this was to find a better place to hide his still. He may also have raised his prices. He certainly didn't quit making deliveries. I don't actually know this, but I suspect that this is done by the same guy that did Bloom County. There's something familiar looking about that hound dog. Anyway, any questions about whether Blue Ruin was a genuine public menace or not are answered rather nicely in the affirmative in the memoirs of one of Johnson's erstwhile partners, a rough-and-ready French-Canadian gambler and all-around rascal named Edward Chambreau, whom we will meet again a little bit later in this talk. Here's Chambreau himself. This is how Chambreau remembers his first liquor run with Johnson in his penitent memoirs, which he wrote 30 years later, after he'd repented of all this early awfulness. Quote, "The next morning the skiff was made ready with a 20-gallon keg of Blue Ruin. This was hid under the things in the bottom of the boat. There were quite a number of Indians camped here, and they were anxious to swap for lum, the word for whiskey. We made them sit down in rows with their different things they had to put their lum in, and whatever they had to pay for it. They were all on the beach, about 10 steps from the skiff. We went to every one before we began to pour it out in their vessels, and agreed on what should be given for this and that measureful. Having done this, Johnson began to pour out, and I carried the things to the boat. The principal things we got in exchange was beaver and otter skins and Hudson's Bay blankets. An Indian, when he drinks whiskey, he will drink as long as he can hold his breath. By the time Johnson was getting through with the last ones, the first ones were getting very funny. He shouted to me to run for the boat. I ran to the boat and shoved it until I was knee-deep in the water. As he had the whiskey, some of them followed him to the boat. He was retreating backwards with his keg under his arm and his long knife in the other hand. In the meantime, I covered him with my rifle. Before it takes time to tell it, he threw the keg with what remained in it as far as he could toward the camp. This gave him a chance to get away from those immediately near him, and he got into it. We were almost in swimming water, with 3 Indians hanging yet to the boat. We knocked them over the head and shoved off in the nick of time, because we had no more than had them loose from the boat than there was a gang of about 30 that came running and yelling with all their might. Then the fighting was among themselves. On this trip we made very near $500 apiece," Chambreau concludes. The reader can draw his own conclusions of what must have been the scene in that Indian camp with 20 gallons of that abominable stuff in them. $500 in 1844 was well over $10,000 in modern currency. It was a big deal. Well, William Johnson died the following year. I haven't been able to find a source that will give me a cause of death for him precisely, but several of them hint that it happened during one of these deliveries. I think I call that poetic justice. Now, I mentioned that bootlegging was Oregon's second oldest profession, right? Well, when it comes to the city of Portland, it's not. It's the first oldest. No, it's not that one either. That's not the first oldest either. There's still number 3 or 4. No, see, the still that Johnson was running when Shambro helped him make that 1847 delivery was tucked away in a gully about 4 miles south of Oregon City, a setting much more in keeping with the spirit of an illicit moonshine still, but it's worth noting the location of the first one he set up, the one that White destroyed when he learned the Native Americans were getting supplied by it. Most likely it was conveniently located very close to his cabin, in the area of what's now Macadam Avenue near the Ross Island Bridge, right in the middle of Portland. Johnson's was the first house in Portland, and seems to have been the first business, too. I guess when you're the only business in Portland, you get to be Business of the Year. Anyway, Oregon's Prohibition law was repealed the year after Johnson died, and after that, the booze flowed pretty freely right up until the 1910s. Pretty freely. There was a time in the 1870s when it was kind of touch and go. Let's talk about that next. This is the ladies' #1 whiskey riot story. April Fool's Day of 1874 is when the forces massed and crossed the frontiers and the forces of Prohibition squared off against a total nut job of a saloon owner in the streets of downtown Portland. Let's set the scene for starters. It's 1874, and Portland is a town that takes its booze seriously. Well, it kind of does now, too, but in 1874 more so. There was one liquor outlet for every 40 men, women, and children in the town. Now, of course, granted, many of those joints catered to sailors and loggers and folks that didn't actually live here, but still, 40 to 1. Watering holes in Portland ran the gamut from the upscale Oro Fino Saloon and Theater at First and Stark's, where you might find judges and mayors and industrialists and stuff hitting the jug and watching theatrical performances, whatever those are, and losing at cards, that went all the way from that down to the sleazy whorehouse grog shop combo joints on 2nd Street north of Burnside. There is some circumstantial evidence that the Oro Fino did a little courtesan mongering as well. I haven't found anything definite, but if it's true, this would be awesome, because the Oro Fino was A, Portland's premier theatrical venue at the time, and B, owned by the police chief. By the way, we'll be getting to know that police chief a little bit better in just a little bit. Well, in 1874, there was no social stigma attached to all but the most desperate levels of alcoholism. Portland was a land of friendly saloons full of functional alcoholics and some non-functional ones too, everybody letting the good times roll. There were some exceptions to this lifestyle, though, a whole class of people who were not invited to the party. Yep. The pleasures of mug and snifter were for all practical purposes reserved to the men, except for the lowest doggeries, in which poverty enforced a certain level of egalitarianism. Women were not allowed in saloons unless they were employed there, if you know what I mean. So the result was that there were an awful lot of non-alcoholic wives of alcoholic husbands, and these ladies were like the designated driver at a wild Oktoberfest party. Only worse, because they had no control. And, that's not even getting started on some of the other effects that alcohol seems to inspire in various family situations. So, the temperance movement really shouldn't have taken anybody by surprise. What was surprising, though, was the form it took in Portland. Portland's temperance drama reached this untoppable climax in April of 1874 with a genuine, bona fide, knock-down, drag-out riot on the streets of downtown Portland as angry citizens exchanged punches and clobbered each other with chairs. By the way, this picture isn't from Portland. It's from Australia, but still, it's a great riot picture. So they're doing this while all the time, serene as if singing in a forest glade, a cluster of upper-class ladies in their Sunday best sang hymns and prayed for their souls. And almost as soon as it appeared, the temperance movement was gone again, apparently destroyed from within after some of the preachers who fancied themselves its leaders overplayed their hand a little bit. So here's the story. Early in the spring of '74, word started reaching Portland of the great temperance movements in Ohio. There were plenty of other temperance movements across the country. There had been for some time. Mostly they took relatively mild form, with mostly women spending lots of time praying and singing in churches and producing art like this, demonstrating there you see on the left the sober, hard-working, industrious, temperate family with the church in the background, and on the right there you have the squalid poverty with the drunk husband and stuff. Yeah. All in all, though, the movement was easily ignored. In Ohio, though, that wasn't the case. There, the temperance movement had found new force. Its members went out into the community and spread the word, and actually went to saloons and watering holes to urge temperance upon their owners and customers. And they'd had some success, especially in persuading saloon keepers to quit the business. Here's an illustration of a saloon keeper ruining $500 or $600 worth of old bourbon. But in Portland, mainstream newspapers like the Morning Oregonian and the Portland Bulletin and the Evening Telegram, they mentioned these events, but only briefly and occasionally. However, those weren't the only papers in town. This is Abigail Scott Dunaway. She was the editor and publisher of the New Northwest, and she was very interested in this. Readers of her weekly paper, which were mostly women, were kept very much up to date on the temperance movement. Dunaway was a legend even in her own time, and her profile has only grown since then. She was utterly committed to equality of the sexes and to voting rights for women, and she saw temperance as an issue that would have been quickly resolved if 50% of the population were not forbidden to vote. In other words, she saw it as a symptom of the great social evil that she had devoted her life to overturning. Dunaway was the sister of legendary Morning Oregonian editor Harvey Scott, although at this time he wasn't editing the Morning Oregonian, he was editing a rival paper, the Bulletin. But that's this ornery-looking cuss, and the two of them were like sparring tigers. Scott was just as intransigently opposed to women's suffrage as Dunaway was committed to it. Well, plenty of women in Portland read the New Northwest, and it was a lively read. Local news of interest to women, serial fiction stories, and tidbits such as recipes and funny anecdotes. Oh, and yes, and it had editorials, too. Dunaway's editorials were every bit as assertive and savage as those her male counterparts wrote at other newspapers. Of course, they were viewed differently. A strong editorial written by a man was a powerful editorial, whereas the same editorial under a woman's byline would be seen as waspish. Right. Well, the New Northwest was very interested in the temperance movement and covered the hell out of its success back east. Get it? Hell. Look down in the bottom left corner there where that train is going. This is probably, though, the main reason that the whole thing came to Portland in the first place. And it's certainly why the fervor of the movement was so startling and unexpected to Portland men, including the cold water preachers to whom the ladies were looking for spiritual guidance on what they'd begun to call their crusade. The men were nearly all caught off guard because they were reading the wrong newspapers. Nonetheless, those preachers rose to the occasion with alacrity. Soon their churches were crammed to bursting with women yearning to do something about this terrible social evil. Enacting outright prohibition was out of the question for the time being, and the ladies knew it well. They had no voting rights with which to support such a move. A 50-year-old bum who had not been sober since he was 13 was a voter. A 40-year-old published quote-unquote authoress with a Ph.D. teaching at Oregon Agricultural College was not. The drunks would vote to keep on drinking. The ladies would have to take a different route. So they assembled in the churches. Stirring sermons got preached. Ladies came to the kneeling rail and told their stories of how alcohol had affected their families. Invitations went out all over Portland to men to come and be inspired, and a pledge of abstinence from alcohol was circulated at each service. Hundreds of people signed. But, well, there was some reason to believe that the fellows signing that pledge weren't the guys doing all the drinking. I mean, if you're a hardcore saloon bum and you feel like going to church, you're not going to set foot inside one of those churches, right? The preacher's up there hollering about temperance and abstinence and the need to drink lots of cold water with no whiskey in it. What? In other words, the chaps who really needed to sign a pledge never went anywhere near a temperance church and probably would have considered themselves in need of an exorcism if they ever did. So what to do? Inspired once again by the New Northwest's dispatches of events in Ohio, the ladies of several Portland churches decided they needed to be more assertive. They and their male pastors organized themselves into something called the Women's Temperance Prayer League. They made their headquarters at the Methodist Church on Taylor Street, and there they decided, as the Portland Daily Bulletin's reporter put it, to go forth and beard the lion in his den. That's right, they were going to go inside the saloons. Now, a few of the more conservative ladies thought this was too much. When the decision was made to do this, they dropped out. But there remained a total of 13 game sisters who were ready to go out there and change the world in the only way their society allowed them to do so. With a prayer and a song and a fabulous but slightly ridiculous hat. And so it was that on March 23rd of 1874, a team of fired-up ladies streamed out of the church and 2 by 2 fanned out across Portland. Their modus operandi was simple. They would present themselves at the saloon, ask the proprietor if they might enter and give a prayer and a song for the sots within. Most of the time the answer was yes. That would change later, but at this early stage they had little trouble. If the saloon keeper offered them a complimentary drink, which more than one did, they would graciously decline. Then they'd pray, sing a hymn or two, circulate a pledge for the drunks to sign promising to abstain from alcohol, sing and pray some more, and then leave. Laura Frances Kelly, one of the temperance workers, wrote a handwritten account of how that went. Quote, "Can you imagine what it would be like to go into a saloon to pray? Then you can imagine how we felt. I cannot tell you. The saloon keeper received us cordially, ushering us into the card room. As the song rose from trembling hearts, Holy Spirit, faithful guide, ever near the Christian's side, etc., the barroom quickly filled with young men to whom the barkeeper freely dispensed his liquors. As we knelt in prayer, the clink of glasses well nigh drowned the petitions that rose from trembling lips. When the short service was over, the barkeeper invited us very pleasantly to come again. Oh, how we hastened back to church in kindred spirits. But the pastor, George W. Iser, met us with, 'Back so soon? Did you only visit one saloon?' Then we saw what was before us." That's George W. Iser there on the left, by the way, that little teenage-looking dude. Seems a little bit thick for him to hang out at the church sending them out and say, "What? Hey, you're not working hard enough." But, I guess that's how it was. Well, at the end of the day, the ladies were exhausted and demoralized. Their reception everywhere had been gracious and welcoming, but at least a part of the reason for that was the spike in liquor trade which they inspired. The presence of 2 respectable Victorian-era ladies in their Sunday best, singing and praying and pleading for temperance, this was a show that packed in crowds. It was like having a circus act in the pub. True, the ladies were treated courteously everywhere, with the bulletin sniff, the notable exception of, quote, "the proprietress of a low doggery on 2nd Street. Not this kind of low doggery, one assumes, but, maybe some more like this one. This actually is a scene from the Ohio protests. That lady on the right there is telling them all to get the hell out. Still, the courteous treatment in the nicer joints mostly took the form of that peculiar variety of chivalrously benevolent condescension that your great-grandpa probably employed while telling your great-grandma not to worry her pretty little head about something. Perhaps thinking the fairer sex too stupid to understand that they were being made fun of, these guys drank toasts to the success of the crusade and eagerly signed fictitious names to the abstinence pledge, and they drank. Oh, yes, they drank, and back in the church the ladies prayed for strength and then went home for the night. The next day things were a little different. Someone, it's not clear who, suggested that rather than fanning out across the city, the ladies should go in a group. All 13 of them would pay a call on a single saloon. This would have several advantages. First off, they would have each other to lean on and not feel so alone in a crowded sea of guys who, though careful to appear chivalrous, were clearly hostile to what they were trying to accomplish. And they would also have more volume during the hymn-singing part to hopefully drown out the clink of glasses. The ladies fortified themselves with a lengthy prayer service and then poured once again out of the church. Today they descended upon the Mount Hood Saloon, owned by a chap named Thomas Shartle. By all accounts, Mr. Shartle was a good egg, and he let them in and have the run of the place. Mr. Shartle did not, however, turn off the taps, and he was probably glad that he did not, because if 2 Victorian ladies in the saloon was a circus act, all 13 of them was like the whole circus. People poured into the Mount Hood. On the surface, it looked like a repeat of the previous day's disaster, only on a bigger scale. Mr. Shartle sold a tremendous volume of alcoholic beverages. The ladies got the same faux hearty stuff. "Best of luck to ya, God bless ya, here's to ya," from the same half-drunk drunks, and fielded the same fake signatures on their temperance pledge. But somehow it was different. The ladies moved on, going down market a bit and visiting a rum house called the Evening Hall. Again, they brought the proprietor plenty of business and left with very few legitimate pledges. Back at the church, the ladies learned that word had gotten around the saloons that their presence represented a large business boom, and one saloon owner actually sent them an invitation to come to his place the next day, which to his delight they did. But the sense of demoralization was utterly gone. The ladies knew they were onto something, so they started going out every day, each day to a different saloon, and slowly things started to change. The upscale Oro Fino, Chief Lappius's joint, was the first establishment to put its money where its gallant mouth was. It shut the taps down during the ladies' visit there. There was still a healthy crowd, but the Oro Fino sold them no drinks until the ladies finished up their service and left. With this example set, the better saloon keepers found themselves pressured to do likewise, which dramatically reduced their incentive to have the ladies over for the afternoon. Even in the pubs that ignored the Oro Fino's example, the money-making magic was fading fast. The crowd of idle, thirsty spectators that had once followed the ladies around from tavern to tavern dwindled away until it comprised only the idlest and the thirstiest. And after a week or so, the Crusaders' arrival at a saloon stopped being an attractant. At the same time, the number of ladies participating in the raid swelled. Soon their arrival meant not a lucrative afternoon of pouring drinks and collecting coin, but not exactly this, but at least the effective shutting down of the bar for as long as the ladies chose to stay. Actually, I'm just using this illustration because I think it looks cool. I want to drink in that bar, although I'm not sure that I would be allowed in. Anyway, more and more saloon keepers began refusing to let the ladies come in. And at first, when this happened, they'd move on. But soon, inspired by the actions of Walter Moffat, more on that in a minute, they changed their tactics. When refused admission to a saloon, they'd stand in front of it on the sidewalk and hold a prayer and song service right there. This was actually worse, because it was like a picket line that customers would have to cross publicly if they wanted to enter the saloon. It also made a public spectacle of the barkeeper's lack of hospitality. Tensions were on the rise as the month of April wore on. On April 14th, at a saloon in the North End, a proprietress slammed the door in the Crusaders' faces, and when the wind blew it back open again, quote, she rushed to the door and poured a volley of abuse upon us, according to the handwritten account of one anonymous temperance worker. But there were successes, too. The same handwritten account goes on, evening call, saloon closed. Proprietor signed the pledge. You'll remember the evening call as the rum shop visited on the first day of the crusade. Edward Chambreau, remember him? He was another saloon keeper who saw the light during one of the ladies' visits. He said that they got treated rather poorly when they first started coming, but at a certain point, he saw the light, closed out his business, and went on the straight and narrow for the rest of his life. And that, as you will have gathered, was quite a transformation. But shutting down saloons is kind of like neutering tomcats. It's not going to have any impact on the number of kittens that are around the town. Still, by the middle of April, the warring parties had settled down into an uneasy sort of relationship in which the saloon keepers tried to keep as low a profile as possible. If you'll pardon an anachronism of a metaphor that's 100 years before its time, they were really trying to stay off the ladies' radar. Most of them did that. There was one exception. It was a joint called the Webfoot Saloon, owned by a cat called Walter Moffat. Now, Walter Moffat was one of Portland's most respected men. By most accounts, he was a decent guy. A Brit by birth, he went to sea as a young man and did well for himself. By the time he arrived in Portland, he was a ship captain. He settled down in Portland and married well. His wife was from a family called Terwilliger, a name which you'll surely instantly recognize. By the time he had settled down in Portland, he was a man of property, owning several shipping interests as well as 2 saloons, the Tom Thumb and the Webfoot. It was the Webfoot Saloon that was to be ground zero in Portland's temperance wars. Because amiable and respectable though Mr. Moffat might have appeared, he turned out to have very little patience for temperance workers. The Webfoot was located on the northwest corner of First and Morrison, just off the waterfront at its more respectable southern end. That's it behind the fire engine in this 1876 pick. Actually, those 2 horses right about the middle of the picture, directly behind them is the door. How the war there got started is unclear. there are two very different accounts of the action. One of them comes to us from the Portland Daily Telegraph, and the other one comes to us from historian Francis Fuller Victor's little book, which was published a little later that year. Fuller Victor, by the way, was the ghostwriter who did all of Bancroft's Histories of Oregon. So she was a big gun. A secret big gun, though, because, of course, we couldn't give a woman credit for something so important. Being sarcastic here. Back to our story. Both accounts agree that Moffat met two of the temperance workers on the first day when they were fanning out across the city, 2 by 2, and that is all they agree on. The Bulletin story the next morning says Mr. Moffat greeted them courteously but declined to let them enter his bar. Mrs. Victor gives a somewhat different account. Quote, "The two ladies, trembling but full of holy zeal, paused at the entrance on Morrison Street and stepped into the saloon, whose proprietor was as unknown to them as the proprietors of other saloons. As they entered, Mr. Moffat, on the alert, entered by the front street door, which brought him face to face with his visitors. Without giving them time to announce their errand, he seized each rudely by an arm and thrust them out into the street, exclaiming, 'Get out of this! I keep a respectable house and don't want any damned whores here.'" She goes on to describe the ladies' shocked reaction to this reception and the horror with which one of them recognizes Mr. Moffat as a family friend. Quote, "Walter Moffat!" she exclaimed. "Can this be Walter Moffat? Why, Walter Moffat, I used to know you, and I prayed with your wife for your safety while you were at sea years ago."
"I don't want any of your damned prayers. I want you to get out of this and stay out. That's what I want of you. I don't keep a whorehouse."
Well, by the way, I have to mention that the original words damned and whore were rendered as D- and W-, but there was no question as to what the words actually were. Yeah, these are words that even today would earn a man, one of the, from pretty much anyone in a position to deliver one. Male, female, bat. The fact that Moffat didn't get one on the spot can probably be chalked up to the utter improbability of his reaction. This was so far out of line with Victorian-era norms of how respectable women were supposed to be treated, it was just surreal. Or maybe it's just because Elastigirl wasn't on the scene, which is too damn bad if you ask me. But in any case, they were too flabbergasted to do anything but make their way back to the Taylor Street Church and tell their story. And that story galvanized the congregation. The temperance crusaders were outraged. They decided to single Walter Moffat out for special attention. For weeks, they tried to wear down his defenses by putting in daily appearances at his saloon, requesting entry, being denied, moving on. Finally, on the last day of March, they changed tactics. This is when, after being denied entry as usual, they started lining up on the sidewalk and launching prayer services right there, right outside of his door. And this, of course, was a bit of an escalation in the conflict, and Moffat's response was almost as tone-deaf as his previous one had been. He emerged from his saloon wearing spectacles and holding himself with prim dignity, a copy of the Holy Bible in one hand, and from this he proceeded to read a selection of passages which, taken out of context, sounded wildly offensive. This is Deuteronomy 23:1, by the way. It's the only verse that the Crusaders actually recorded him as having quoted. Well, the ladies sang louder to drown him out. Moffat increased his own volume until he was actually shouting, and this went on for some time, attracting, as you can imagine, a healthy crowd of spectators. And finally the ladies moved on. But before they left, one of them tearfully asked Moffat why he was behaving like this. His bellicose response was that he minded his own business and he expected others to mind theirs, and he called the Crusaders hypocrites. Well, that evening back at the church, the ladies discussed Moffat at great length. Was he simply incorrigible, a waste of their time? Should they simply leave him on his road to hell and focus their attention on more salvageable souls? Or was his bizarre and erratic and offensive behavior a call for help? Strange as it sounds, the call for help theory is the one that prevailed. Some of the ladies argued, successfully as it turned out, that this strange behavior must stem from an uneasy conscience, and that meant that he was not beyond the reach of salvation. So, what Brother Moffat needed right now was not to be abandoned to his depravities and the blandishments of Satan. but rather to feel the tough, brave love of his true friends who would be there to support his struggle for righteousness, no matter how viciously he tried in his devil-induced madness to drive them away. Well, looked at that way, leaving Walter Moffat alone would be a seriously sinful and selfish act, right? One that the ladies figured they'd be called to account for on Judgment Day. Nope. Poor Brother Moffat would continue to receive his special treatment, along with earnest and loving prayers for his salvation. In other words, Mr. Moffat's behavior had not only failed to persuade the ladies to leave him alone, it had put the full force of divine authority behind a mandate to continue pestering him, and the poor dolt clearly had no idea what he had done. Well, Mr. Moffat, the next day, continued to show the world his stunning lack of good judgment by hiring some thugs and buying and stockpiling some firecrackers for the ladies' next visit. When they arrived, Mr. Moffat's goon squad went into action, beating big Chinese gongs in their faces and tossing lighted strings of firecrackers under their feet. This was the opening hostilities. It was April Fool's Day, 1874, when he crossed this Rubicon. Before this day, the only ungentlemanly behavior that Moffat had actually engaged in had been a private conversation with two ladies whom he was ejecting from his bar. Now, in front of the whole city, he and his thugs were not only being very disrespectful, they were putting the ladies in danger of a broken ankle, or even burning to death, because much of the clothing of the day was highly flammable, and that would be all that he would need, would be for one of those firecrackers to catch someone's skirt on fire. The crowd of onlookers was shocked. Then it started murmuring ominously and moving closer. Luckily, the police were standing by, sensing that something ugly was about to happen. It's hard to say ugly with a straight face while those shorts are on the screen. But they hurried in and persuaded the ladies to break off the engagement. But the tone-deaf Moffat seems to have taken precisely the wrong lesson away from this episode. Spared the consequences that his tactics were about to bring down on his head, he concluded that they were just the ticket to get the ladies to leave him alone. The ladies gave him a week and then returned on April 7th. A force of 15 of them stationed themselves in front of the webfoot and started singing and praying. Word spread like an electric current through Portland, and in minutes a crowd of onlookers was blocking the streets and sidewalks, effectively shutting down the bar, ready to watch the battle. Moffat, in a swift change of tactics, perhaps the gong beaters and firecracker throwers that he'd hired had given up and gone home during the 7-day truce, he got out his police whistle and started blasting on it, summoning Portland Police Chief Lappius to the scene. This Chief Lappius. Now remember, Chief Lappius, James Lappius, was a frontier Portland dude who wore many hats. He wore his officer of the law hat, certainly, but also his gambler and saloon keeper hat, and probably also a pimp hat. Now, Portland was a small town, so it's a pretty good bet that the ladies knew exactly what their police chief was in real life. The people in the crowds knew, too, and so did Moffat. When Lappius arrived, he demanded that the cops disperse the praying women. They were, he asserted, disturbing the peace by attracting an unruly crowd of onlookers, whatever lookers, anyway. Oddly enough, it doesn't seem to have occurred to anybody to actually disperse that crowd of onlookers. Convenient, huh? So our hero, Pimp L here, approached the ladies and asked them to leave. They declined. The chief told them that if they stuck around and another riot broke out, people could get hurt. They replied that that was up to God and to those people. They were just here to pray and sing. They're minding their own business. So the chief arrested them. Now, in today's world, this kind of conflict of interest would be outrageous. One saloon keeper helping out another saloon keeper by arresting a dozen ladies who were clearly doing nothing illegal, but clearly doing something inconvenient to his saloon-keeping friends' interests. In 1870s Portland, though, it apparently wasn't. I don't know, maybe at UC Davis it isn't either. But anyway, the ladies also surely knew Chief Lappius's reputation, or Lappius. I'm not actually quite sure how to pronounce his name. J.D. Chandler, the historian of criminal stuff in Portland, pronounces it Lappius. I've always pronounced it Lappius. I don't really know. but sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. Anyway, he was a former Goldfield gambler who, as city marshal 7 years before, had almost lost his job over allegations that he'd offered to let Danford Balch, the convicted shotgun murderer, escape from city jail for a $1,000 bribe. Chances are good that he did not occupy the moral high ground in the eyes of the ladies he was arresting, but they were upright, law-abiding women, and so off went the ladies in one of the most remarkable impromptu parades ever. Not the most remarkable impromptu parade ever, but close. We had the police chief in front in the full dignity of office, 15 ladies in their finest attire gliding fabulously along like Thanksgiving parade balloons behind, and a dangerously huge crowd of onlookers bringing up the rear. Moffat was left behind at his suddenly empty bar. This isn't Moffat's actual bar, but it probably looked a lot like this. Anyway, this must have felt like being in the eye of the hurricane. There had been a lot of noise and action before. There would be a lot more noise and action after, but everything was quiet and ominously still. Well, almost miraculously, hey, I made up a new word. Almost miraculously, husbands and sons and fellow temperance workers materialized at the police station, all eager to bail the ladies out. But the ladies, who had started singing hymns again, refused to give or take a nickel, and they were accordingly loaded into the jail, where they spent another 2 or 3 hours singing and praying, while the authorities, eager to get them out as fast as possible before the crowd got any uglier, frantically rounded up the magistrates and officers of the court that they would need to process them through. Once they did, things got very brief. In court, Judge Denny dismissed the complaint almost immediately, ruling that standing on a public sidewalk and singing hymns did not constitute disorderly conduct. Sorry, guys. The ladies visited the saloon a week later, but stayed for only half an hour. Presumably Moffat was not yet ready to join battle. But 2 days after that, on April 16th, he was. The webfoot was fortified. Moffat had tooled up for a showdown. In a rare display of wisdom, he'd gotten rid of the firecrackers, but he'd traded in his gongs for bigger and louder models and hired a couple local urchins to beat on them. He'd also acquired a hand organ, the kind that organ grinders used to crank away on while a trained monkey danced to the dismay and fury of everybody who was stuck within earshot. And then, of course, there was also Moffat's police whistle. When the temperance gang rolled up in front of the joint a little after 2 p.m., Team Moffat was ready for them. And the fight was on. The boys wailed on the gongs, a local drunk hired for the event cranked furiously on the organ, Moffat's whistle shrilled away. Even before the ladies had started their devotionals, the streets of Portland were ringing with an unbelievable racket that brought spectators sprinting to the scene from blocks around. Here's how Malcolm Clark Jr. put it in his 1957 essay in the Oregon Historical Quarterly, in which he tells this story. Clark tells the story pretty well, but his style is kind of breezy and a little bit condescending. If you happen to be female, you probably will find his style insulting. But he does a pretty good job of describing this scene. Quote, "This hideous clamor continued for an hour, the crusaders meanwhile calmly saying prayers and singing songs which not even those closest to them could hear. Fritz, the organ grinder, grew arm-weary. The two boys, despite the encouraging shouts of their commander, were perceptibly weakening. Moffat's face had acquired a purplish cast." Well, pretty soon the gong boys gave out completely. The organ, subsequently, was smashed by a public-spirited bystander who probably got stood around with drinks for his part in that, and the bartender, J.F. Good, then came out and grabbed one of the gongs, and the erstwhile organist seized the other. According to the bulletin, one of the two soon thereafter lost his gong. Beating it as hard as he could inches from the face of one of the ladies, a Mrs. Stitzel, he was surprised when she acknowledged his presence for the first and only time by suddenly snatching the gong from him and, quote, retaining possession of it. According to Fuller Victor, Moffat actually tried to recover the gong robber style by pointing a pistol at her head and demanding that she give it back. But Stitzel silently called his bluff. The gun went back in his pocket, and the gong stayed out of service. The gong beater involved in this little bit of pistol waving was probably Mr. Good, because we know that around 5 p.m. he was no longer operating a gong. We know this because that's the point at which now you have to remember, he'd been drinking all day, going back in and out of the saloon, getting a little nip of Dutch courage to keep up his spirits and strength, and by now he was good and drunk. Squared off and started swearing, bitterly and profanely, at the line of singing, praying ladies. And it was too much. You just never know what's going to set a crowd off. And in this case, this display of drunken churlishness was enough for bystander William Grooms, who, by the way, had been Portland's city marshal back in 1853. And Grooms now approached the sloppy, obscenity-spluttering Mr. Good and hauled off and flattened him with a powerful punch square in the middle of the face. The crowd exploded. Fists and elbows flew. Uninvited guests surged into the Webfoot Saloon with mayhem in their minds. Moffat and his little band backed away as best they could, sought refuge behind the bar. Glasses broke. Chairs flew. Moffat got his pistol back out of his pocket. He probably would have used it if it had been not a single shot, which, of course, if it was a single shot, then, you get one shot out and then everybody jumps you and yeah. How this whole affair managed not to end with anybody getting shot is kind of a mystery, but the police must have been keeping a close eye on the situation, because they were on the scene within minutes. They didn't shut it down, they didn't ask the ladies to leave, they simply restored order and withdrew. Moffat was down a gong, the organ was a total loss. With a few tin cans and the one remaining gong, he and his crew carried on till 6 p.m., when the ladies quietly withdrew. On almost every possible level, they had won the day. Pressing their advantage, the ladies were back the next day at 10 a.m., and word spread quickly. Within minutes, the streets and sidewalks were jammed with spectators ready for the show. But inside the Webfoot Saloon, all was quiet. Instead of engaging the enemy, Moffat hustled down the road to the police station and swore out a complaint against the ladies for disorderly conduct, or rather disturbing the peace, based on the riot that had broken out the previous day. There were 21 ladies on the scene that day, but only 6 of them were repeat customers from the previous day. So these 6 stalwarts were arrested and charged, and the other 15, although arrested, were promptly released. The legal concept of disturbing the peace was creaking under the strain of what the prosecutors were trying to get it to do. The idea was, though the ladies hadn't disturbed the peace personally, they had showed up and prayed on a sidewalk, knowing that doing so would inspire others to disturb the peace by, for example, rioting and trashing the Webfoot. The fact that the rioters actually had been inspired by the plaintiff's activities rather than the defendants', well, that was conveniently overlooked. It took a couple of days for the trial to finish up, for the jury to come to a decision. But one of the jury members was a saloon owner, the other 5 were business owners of other types. Their natural sympathy lay with the guy trying to sell beer, not with the citizens outside, interfering with commerce and trade by exercising their First Amendment rights to sing and pray in public. So, to no one's surprise, the verdict was guilty, and the ladies were sentenced to spend a night in jail or pay $5. Offers to pay their fines poured in immediately, but like Socrates refusing to go into exile, they insisted on doing the time instead. So the 6 crusaders were carted off to the Hooskow, accompanied by a large crowd of well-wishers. Hordes of visitors trooped in and out of the jail, and the joint rang with the sound of 6 determined voices belting out hymn after hymn, and finally visiting hours ended, and the ladies settled down for the night. It couldn't have been more than half an hour later that James Lappius, Chief Lappius, stormed into the jail and ordered them to get the hell out. The ladies, assuming this was another attempt to cut them a break, hurried to reassure him that they were quite ready to stay the night, like the judge said. The chief didn't even let them finish. "I'm the boss here," he roared. "You leave!" And leave they did. After this episode, the temperance workers virtually owned Portland. I'm using this image again because I love it. Mrs. P.J. Gilligan's bar looks like my kind of place. But anyway, Moffat was bedeviled on almost a daily basis. His behavior continued to be odd and erratic, but for the most part, knowing he was fighting a losing battle, he contented himself with, according to Clark, quote, following his tormentors around, muttering imprecations and offering unsolicited advice. However, on occasion he would do something aggressive. On May 1st, he made history in what was surely the first use of tear gas in Portland history. On that day, I know, right? This is like the most offensive cartoon I've ever seen in my life. On that day, he emerged from his advertisement. He emerged from his saloon with a wet handkerchief around his nose and some sort of vile-smelling smoke pouring from the pockets of the old overcoat he was wearing. Apparently, a mixture of tobacco and pepper. The smell was almost suffocating. Moffat, free to move about, could leave the cloud of stinging smoke behind, whereas the singing and praying ladies more or less had to stay in one spot and endure it as best they could. Moffat was actually hauled into court for this bit of chemical warfare, but on May 21st he was acquitted. Quote, "The jury were all liquor men," an anonymous crusader wrote. On May 27th, the same crusader reported, quote, "Mr. Moffat of the Webfoot, still a tool for Satan, executing the designs of the devil with astonishing intrepidity." I did not bring a visual along tonight to go with tool for Satan. You're welcome. Anyway, as late as June, Moffat was still occasionally throwing firecrackers, but his tactics seemed to have shifted from pitched battle to isolated harassment. Sadly, the chronicles are silent on the question of what impact his behavior had on his business. My personal chronicles are actually silent on what I was planning on doing with this image, with Neo and the Lincoln Continental pulled up at the Webfoot Saloon. I have no idea why I thought that was going to relate to the story, but here it is. As I explained while we were doing the show at the Jack London, stumps me. But anyway, I did have to wonder if the drinkers of Portland rallied around the Webfoot, supporting Moffat in his little war, or did they start avoiding him, uncomfortable with the ungentlemanly behavior for which he was becoming famous? We don't really know. But we do know that within a year, Walter Moffat had left town. So that's kind of a good sign. More on that in a little bit. First, though, I want to tell you about the election. As Election Day approached, a new newspaper, the Temperance Star, was launched. Mrs. Dunaway's women's suffrage publication apparently was not deemed ideologically pure enough. Actually, it wasn't a women's suffrage publication. It was just a publication that endorsed women's suffrage. A full slate of temperance candidates was drafted and put forward for the coming election. And then on the day of the election, in early July, a little publication was distributed all over Portland titled The Voters' Book of Remembrance. Although it was not actually a book, it was a half sheet of paper printed on both sides. And this innocuously titled circular was unsigned, but everyone assumed the League had published it. It almost certainly had. But if the saloon keepers had put it out as a dirty campaign trick, they would have been very pleased with the result. The Voters' Book of Remembrance put the entire city into a cold fury. Its language doesn't sound too bad to the modern ear, but in 1874 it was outrageously crude. Here's what it said. Voters of Portland, or this is the beginning of it. Voters of Portland, the Book of Remembrance is this day opened, and you are called upon to choose whom ye will serve. On one hand are found prostitutes, gamblers, rum sellers, whiskey topers, beer guzzlers, wine bibbers, rum suckers, hoodlums, loafers, and ungodly men. On the other hand are found Christian wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of the good people of Portland. You cannot serve two masters. You must be numbered with one or the other. Whom will ye choose? After a few more indignant and ponderous paragraphs of similar high dudgeon, the little circular concluded, Remember that persons are known by the company they keep. Birds of a feather flock together. In other words, as historian Clark puts it, quote, Any citizen low enough to vote against the temperance candidates was a supporter of sin, an un-American scoundrel, and an arch foe of home and mother. The temperance candidates, who 24 hours before the election had looked like shoo-ins, were trounced. The Women's Temperance Prayer League vanished, its constituents slinking away from the public relations fiasco that someone had signed their name to. It was replaced with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which lasted for years but never had the same kind of influence. As for Moffat, he sold his saloons shortly after this and sailed off to the South Seas. It's a Relatively unremarkable thing to do today, but a fairly odd action for a middle-aged married man of property to take in 1875. In that era of small, vulnerable sailing ships, sketchy navigation, and non-existent weather forecasting, people just didn't go to sea unless they had to. In any case, Moffat died en route. His cause of death was a puzzle for the skipper of the ship, Dynamite Johnny O'Brien. By the way, there are two Dynamite Johnnies. One on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. This is the West Coast Johnny. Dynamite Johnny reports that Moffat came back drunk from a stop in port and just never sobered up. It's at least possible that he was suffering through the final stages of syphilis, which in that era caused many a middle-aged man to become mentally unhinged and then die early. It happened to a few other rascals, and it certainly happened to plenty of sailors. Certainly it would explain why a man who had clearly once had enough good judgment to build several successful businesses suddenly thought it would be okay to throw firecrackers at praying ladies on the streets and call them damned whores. But of course, we can't ever really know. The last thing I'm going to do tonight is set the scene for next month's show. What it has to do with the shadow, I don't know. This is another one of those ones that I put in here, and I had a plan for why it was going to tie into the story, and I have no idea what I was thinking. Must have been late at night. It is nautical, though, and we're going to talk about a lot of nautical stuff next month. I am going to leave you guys hanging not because I want to, but because I sort of have to. There's too much good stuff here for one 60-minute show, and gripping and thrilling as I'm sure I am as a speaker, you don't want 2 hours of me. Trust me. So, late in 1912, for the sixth and final time, the topic of voting rights for women was on Oregonians' ballot. And when the votes were counted, it was a win. A 52% majority had voted for women's suffrage. The weird part is to think about just 101 years ago. That was not very long ago. 48% of Oregon men rather, thought that women shouldn't be allowed to vote. I mean, it's kind of like the 1 out of 5 dentists who doesn't recommend that people who chew gum choose sugarless gum. What are they thinking? Seriously, 100 years is a blink of an eye. We are living in an era of cultural revolution. But back to our story. The campaigns against letting women vote are some of the goofiest things in public relations history. If you're able to avoid getting actually upset about them, they make some fairly entertaining reading. That's probably because they weren't sincere. I mean, look at this one. Don't let her vote or she'll put you to work doing laundry while she smokes chocolate cigars and plays poker. Yeah, that's how that works. Anyway, but their insincerity could be checked at the door. There was a certain cadre of anti-suffrage men who, if you got them to speak frankly and off the record, they would tell you straight out the real reason that they didn't want to give women the right to vote. Prohibition. By the way, you can't really see the labels on these guys here. The skinny one on the left says slaver. The woman in the middle left has a label on that says anti. I'm not sure what anti is. The big guy in the middle is big biz, and the other big guy on the right says liquor. I don't think this is accurate. I think it's all liquor. For decades, temperance and women's suffrage movements had been, to one degree or another, associated with each other. And every woman knew a friend who was helplessly saddled with a hard-drinking husband who couldn't keep a job and was trying desperately to keep the family together despite having no control. And you better believe the liquor men remembered 1874. By the way, this is a bit of a digression, but that triumphant husband holding the pledge, doesn't that look just like Edgar Allan Poe? There's an alternative universe here. By 1912, though, it was almost a cliche that when women's suffrage initiatives were defeated, suffrage activists would blame the setback on, quote, the liquor men. And they were right. Most bar owners and brewers and distillers pulled every string they could reach to try to stop women from getting the vote. Because they knew. They knew the instant women had electoral clout, they would use it to eliminate what many of them saw as the great social evil of their day, the bottle. The liquor men were right. In Oregon, at least, because as soon as women got the vote in 1912, preparations were underway for a Prohibition initiative, slated to hit the books in 1914, and it passed with flying colors. Oregon was now a dry state. You could still bring liquor in from out of state and consume it in the privacy of your own home, but you couldn't buy it and you couldn't sell it. And you sure couldn't blow your whole paycheck on it while playing faro in the corner bar before staggering home with empty pockets to your long-suffering wife. By the way, that's a Michigan National Guard tank squishing those stills there, but it was such a cool image that I just had to use it. In the next cycle, 2 years later, 1916, even that loophole was closed, and Oregon was now bone dry. The era of bootleggers and moonshiners and blind pigs and speakeasies had begun. The primary effect of early Prohibition in Oregon seems to have been to enable Oregon bootleggers to get some practice in before the federal government got involved and the consequences became serious. So when the Volstead Act passed in 1919, inaugurating nationwide prohibition, Oregon's midnight entrepreneurs were ready to go. First rattle out of the box, Oregon was pretty much supplying most of the West Coast with illegal hooch. That's the Gallon House Bridge right there, by the way. We'll be talking about that next month as well. Famous bridge, it's the Gallon House that it was referring to was probably a vinegar jug full of something that wasn't vinegar. Portland had always had a special mercantile relationship with Vancouver and Victoria up in British Columbia. These two cities had, for most of the 1890s, partnered with Portland to bring most of the opium into the country to supply Chinese communities in various West Coast cities. The smuggling routes were time-tested, the smugglers were well-trained, it was just a case of bringing in a different cargo. The usual routine was that a small Canadian ship, crammed with distilled spirits, would sail south along the coastline and heave to 12 miles off the mouth of the Columbia River. From there, safe in international waters, it would rendezvous with several small, powerful launches, which would transfer as much booze as they could safely carry and cross the bar and race upriver. Once they reached a prearranged remote spot, often on Sovie Island, they'd pull in and unload and head back out again. Do it again till the rum-runner was empty, and then the ship would head back to BC to do it all over again. And this made for some frustrating times for prohibitionists. They couldn't touch the big ship in international waters, and the individual launches were way faster than anything they had. By the way, it's almost certain that the Pescawa, the Canadian rum runner caught in 1926 after it left the safety of international waters to rescue a lifeboat full of shipwrecked sailors off the mouth of the Columbia, was participating in this smuggling operation. And it's that story that we'll start off unpacking when we get together again next month, on Tuesday, January 7th, 2014, for Bootlegging the Oregon Way Part 2, The Volstead Years. Thank you very much for coming to my show, or if you didn't come to my show, for checking it out in this presentation. And don't forget to stop by offbeatoregon.com and check out all the other stuff that I do. And if you ever happen to be in Corvallis and you want to spend a little bit of time talking with a fellow history geek over, let's face it, you're clearly a fellow history geek if you've been listening to me this long, over a cup of coffee in the little coffee shop that we have in the library there at OSU, drop me a note. Love to hear from you. I'm at finn@offbeatoregon.com. Okay, thanks again. Now go out and fill up the rest of the day with good stuff, will you? Bye now.